Ann Dustin Wilson entered the world in the summer of 1950 in San Diego, in a family where music, somewhat unexpectedly, was the main source of entertainment. Even though Ann's mother was a concert pianist, it was her father, John, a Marine Corps major, who truly set the tone. Because his work required the family to move often, he created stability at home by hosting little musical evenings in which everyone took part. Surprisingly, Ann, but unlike her younger sister Nancy, wasn't very interested in music during her early years. The future rock icon was shy, struggled with a speech impediment, and even battled childhood obesity. Everything changed when she turned 12 and came down with a serious case of mononucleosis. To keep her occupied at home, Ann's mother bought her an acoustic guitar. That moment didn't just spark her future career, it helped solve the issues that had made her a target for teasing. Ann began developing her voice, and through singing she overcame her stutter. A few school performances later, she found herself surrounded, not by bullies but by friends who admired her voice instead of laughing at her weight. With music quite literally transforming her life, it's no surprise that after graduating high school in 1968, Ann couldn't imagine doing anything else. Her first steps came in 1969 as the vocalist of a band called the Daybreaks. They recorded a few songs but never achieved real success. For Ann, though, it was invaluable experience. Microphone squealing, rehearsals in stuffy garages, small local gigs, first fans. She learned to hear herself, to control the voice that was slowly becoming her signature weapon. After the Daybreaks, Ann jumped between several small bands in search of something real, until one attempt finally clicked. In 1972, she responded to a newspaper ad from a group called Whiteheart, which needed a lead singer at the time. The band, essentially built around Steve Fossen and Roger Fisher, struggled to settle on both a name and a sound. But Ann's arrival changed everything. By 1973, the name Heart stuck, and so did their musical direction. Ann didn't just shape the band's identity, she also influenced their starting point in a much more literal way. During one show in northern Washington, Roger Fisher's older brother Mike, who had dodged the draft and was hiding out in Vancouver, slipped across the border just to see Heart perform. Ann fell head over heels for him. Within months, she convinced the band to move to Vancouver so she could be with Mike, and so he could become their manager. The move made sense musically, too. The Canadian rock scene of the mid-70s was less competitive and more receptive to emerging bands. With friendlier press and fewer barriers, Heart developed faster than they likely would have in the US. By 1974, Ann brought her younger sister Nancy into the band, and Heart began working intensely on their debut album. Signing with Mushroom Records was easy, and in 1975 they released Dreamboat Annie. Without diminishing the contributions of the other members, the album was, in many ways, Ann's personal statement. She stepped fully into the role of band leader, pouring her instinctive musicality into every track. You can feel her airy softness in Dreamboat Annie, the sensual heat in Magic Man, and that breakthrough, explosive vocal power in Crazy on You. In that song especially, her voice becomes a weapon, fragile one moment, detonating the next. She doesn't just sing, she bursts into the space, forcing the listener to look her way. In 1976, the album was released in the United States, and to everyone's surprise, it became a commercial success, reaching number 7 on the American charts. Strangely enough, the success was most unexpected for Ann herself. She later admitted that even though she was the band's driving force, she constantly struggled with self-doubt, always wondering whether she sounded good enough, whether her decisions were the right ones. When success finally arrived, the insecurity faded, but it was quickly replaced by the weight of leadership. The first pressure came from touring. Exhausting schedules, sleepless travel, and the emotional responsibility of holding the band together. On stage, she was a queen. Offstage, she was the teammate who could crack a joke, ease tension, or simply listen when someone needed it. Then came the pressure from producers and radio stations. Not only were they demanding new hits, but American radio launched a boycott against Heart, claiming the band sounded too much like Led Zeppelin. Ann took this especially hard, not because of the comparison, but because of the unfairness. She was creating something honest, something of her own, not copying anyone. It felt like a cold shock after the supportive comfort of the Canadian rock scene. Heart already knew how to command a stage, but the scrutiny they faced in the US was sharp, relentless, almost as if someone wanted to shove them back across the border. In 1977, Little Queen was released, an album that showcased the band's growing confidence and especially Ann's evolution. Barracuda was born out of pure fury after a journalist asked an aggressively rude question implying a romantic relationship between her and Nancy. Anne walked out of the interview with her head high, clenched her teeth, and poured everything into the song's lyrics. It became a manifesto. Fast, fierce, razor sharp. In the studio, she pushed so hard that sound engineers had to step in to check if she was okay. Her voice was hitting the red zone, as if trying to break through the walls. Barracuda didn't just become a hit. It became her personal punch thrown at an industry that thought it could decide Hart's place. Little Queen solidified the band's early success, and Anne emerged as one of the most unmistakable figures in women's rock. Dark-haired, powerful, with a voice that could split silence. But behind that powerful presence, fatigue was building, and inside the band, harmony was beginning to crack. By the late 70s, Nancy Wilson was in a relationship with Roger Fisher, while Anne was still dating his brother Mike. At first, their tangled personal lives didn't affect the band, but once they hit peak popularity, things became harder. Relationship drama began spilling into creative disagreements, and sometimes the other way around. On top of that, Anne and Nancy wanted to grow musically, more emphasis on songs, ballads, vocal storytelling, emotional depth. Roger, meanwhile, leaned toward harder, guitar-driven, improvisational rock. He believed Hart could become the next Led Zeppelin. The Wilson sisters believed Hart needed to be Hart. Amid the chaos, Anne managed to hold her ground and keep the group together. Out of this turbulent period came the 1978 album, Dog and Butterfly. It clearly reflected Anne's vision, softer, more thoughtful, more mature. The songs felt as if she wasn't just telling stories anymore, but sharing experiences, reflections, lessons formed after the storm of early success offstage. She seemed to grow up as well. She read more. She avoided parties. She stayed close to Nancy. While the world expected her to follow the usual rock and roll cliches, Anne was trying to find balance instead. In 1979, Anne Wilson ended her relationship with Michael Fisher. She later said he had simply fallen in love with another woman, but the truth is their relationship had been cracking for years. Michael was trying to support his brother. He wanted Hart to become a hit-making machine. Anne wanted to create. For her, music had always been an instrument and a weapon. For him, it was just business. After that breakup, Roger Fisher also split from Nancy, and by 1980, he was essentially pushed out of the band. Anne had been the leader all along, but Hart still had a structure. 2 sisters, 2 brothers. Their fiery relationships fueled the band, on stage and in the songs. When Roger left, something inside the group and inside their music felt hollow. You can hear it immediately on Bebe Lestrange, released in 1980. It was recorded without Roger, and it sounds as if Anne is trying to hold up the collapsing house with her voice alone. Even It Up is a perfect example. She carries the entire song on her breath. Rough, confident, rolling forward like a wave. It was their way of shouting, "We're still alive." Behind the scenes, the arguments didn't stop. No one knew where the band was supposed to go or what they should sound like. Anne refused to chase trends. She wanted to stay honest with the audience and with herself, but the fickle listener wasn't ready for that. In 1982, Hart released Private Audition, a quiet, almost secretive album where you can hear just how heavily Anne was carrying the creative burden on her own. It wasn't a hit, but it stands as a document of her internal struggle. She experiments with new tones, softer, deeper, more intimate. Cities Burning is a track where her voice seems to scorch the space from the inside, as if she feels the fire herself. But clouds gathered around the album. Sales were weak. The tours weren't the same. Critics were lukewarm. Hart began to be seen as a band losing its position. Anne took that to heart. She knew she had more to give, but she didn't know which direction to move. The next album, Passion Works, 1983, became a turning point almost by accident. You can hear them searching for a new sound. Synthesizers, a sleeker production style, a move away from their classic rock foundation. The album wasn't a commercial breakthrough, but it's where Anne discovered new dimensions of her voice. Wider range, more control, more nuance. Listen to How Can I Refuse? She sounds like a true frontwoman of the 80s, flexible, powerful, commanding. Meanwhile, crucial changes were happening behind the scenes. Hart changed management, fielded offers from major labels, and debated whether to reinvent their image. The industry had a simple demand: adapt to MTV or disappear. Anne resisted. She was afraid Hart would lose its soul, but she also knew that without change, they wouldn't survive. So by the mid-80s, to pull Hart out of a commercial nosedive, she and Nancy agreed to restructure the band, renew their contract, and fully embrace a new style. More pop-oriented, more video-driven, more polished. Anne experienced this shift as a kind of personal war. She wanted to sing with power, honesty, and raw rock energy, but the industry wanted hit singles with giant choruses and a flawless visual aesthetic. And yet, she managed to pour herself into those new expectations. During rehearsals, she worked her vocal parts like an athlete preparing for the Olympics. Every climb, every sustained note, every transition. It was in this period that her voice became what MTV-era listeners remember: dense, rich, and absolutely massive. In 1985, Heart was reborn with their self-titled album. It wasn't just well-received, it shot straight to the top of the Billboard 200. What About Love opened the new era? Anne sang as if she were tunneling straight through solid walls. In These Dreams, where Nancy took the lead, it was Anne who built the vocal framework around her, soft, assured, mature. But the true breakthrough came with Alone. It wasn't just a hit, it was a demonstration of what the human voice can do under pressure. Anne hit the high notes so powerfully that the studio engineers joked they were waiting for the tubes to explode. That song became Heart's calling card for the next decade. And it was her triumph. The price of this rebirth, however, was painfully high. The label wanted Heart to look like an MTV band. Corsets, massive hair, exaggerated silhouettes, and a woman with a strong body and an even stronger voice became the target of constant comments about her appearance. Video directors tried to hide her in the shadows, pushed her to the side of the frame, shifted focus to the slimmer Nancy. For Anne, it was a brutal blow. It felt as if she were back in school, being teased for her weight and her former stutter. She had to swallow it all. She could no longer be the rock feminist who defended her rights through her lyrics. Now she stood confident on set in the morning and cried in her hotel room at night. During this period, Nancy played a crucial role. She defended Anne's boundaries, supported her through the worst moments, and kept her from breaking It Mattered. Because the success wasn't stopping. The 1987 album Bad Animals cemented their status as superstars. Alone dominated radio, and Who Will You Run To sounded like a challenge to the entire industry. Every line driven by Anne's struggle to be seen not as a pretty accessory, but as a force. On stage, she sang like she was trying to shake the arena's roof loose. No insults, no criticism of her body could touch her voice. The more pressure she felt, the stronger she sounded. By the end of the 80s, Heart were performing in massive venues, touring non-stop, filming video after video. Backstage, the atmosphere was a mix of euphoria and complete exhaustion. It hit Anne the hardest. She battled panic attacks that struck right before she went on stage. She could sit in the dressing room barely breathing, then walk out 2 minutes later in front of 20,000 people and deliver Alone, as if she had not an ounce of fear in her body. She learned to trap the panic in her chest and control it the way she controlled her breath before a long note. At the same time, the fatigue was overwhelming. In a way, the entire band felt it. In 10 years, they had survived collapse, rebirth, and another rise to the top, something that takes some bands decades. Out of that exhaustion came Brigade in 1990. Despite everything, it sold millions, and All I Want to Do Is Make Love to You became an international hit. After the album, Heart wanted a break. Anne sensed that the industry was about to change again, and she hoped that she and Nancy might once more gain creative control to make what they wanted, not what the label demanded. The band pushed out Desire Walks On in 1993, the last mainstream Heart album of that era. Even in her exhaustion, Anne delivered several powerful moments. In songs like Black on Black 2, you can hear her trying to reclaim the ferocity she had in the 70s. The album wasn't a major hit, the times had changed, but it stands as proof that Anne wasn't ready to surrender her place, even when the wind was blowing against her. Meanwhile, conflicts with labels kept tensions high. As before, at the turn of the decade, the band was trying to redefine itself and couldn't understand why they were suddenly being labeled the old guard. By the mid-1990s, Anne and Nancy made an important decision, a temporary step back from Heart, an unofficial hiatus. It wasn't a breakup, it was a breath of air. For the first time in decades, Anne found herself alone, trying to understand who she was without the massive rock machine behind her. The sisters created a side project, The Lovemongers, and it became a lifeline Anne could finally sing, not what the charts demanded, but what rose straight out of her chest. Their acoustic version of Crazy on You, their work on the single's soundtrack, it was a small revolution. Anne returned to intimacy and sincerity, qualities almost buried under the gloss of the 80s. During this time, she performed in smaller venues, recorded covers, and experimented with warmer, softer shades of her voice. It was as if she were learning her own instrument all over again, without packed arenas, without producers, without the pressure of music videos. And in the late 90s, Ann Wilson finally did what she had feared for so long. She started a solo career. Slowly, carefully, but confidently, she performed with orchestras, took part in tributes, recorded duets, and everywhere her voice sounded deeper, richer, more reflective than ever before. But Ann could never truly exist without Hart. In the early 2000s, the Wilson sisters reunited in the studio. They were tired of corporate label pressure and wanted to bring Hart back to where it all began, to real instruments, honest music, and the spirit of the road, rather than the chase for chart positions. That's why Jupiter's Darling appeared in 2004, an album that became for Ann what a fresh palette becomes for a painter. It was miles away from the glossy 80s sound, rich acoustic textures, Roger Dean's gritty guitar tones creaking beneath Ann's voice like old wooden steps underfoot. Here, Ann wasn't singing as the rebellious girl of the 70s or the MTV queen of the 80s. She was a grown woman who understood the weight of both joy and pain. In songs like Oldest Story in the World and I Need the Rain, her voice feels deeper, wider, and emotionally sharper. She no longer tried to prove she could hit the highest notes. She was showing that she could tell the truth. Behind the scenes, there was a rare harmony. The sisters moved at the same rhythm, unhurried, working at their own pace. Ann was going through a creative renewal, and you could see it in everything she did. Riding this new wave, she made a few major decisions in her personal life. The first was adopting her daughter, Marie. Motherhood arriving in her 50s was both a shock and a healing force. The second was finally confronting the lifelong struggle with her weight. Ann agreed to undergo surgery, a symbolic step after years of defending her body from public scrutiny. She insists she didn't do it for beauty, but to preserve her ability to sing on stage and give fans everything they deserved. In 2007, Hart released Dreamboat Annie Live. A tribute to their own debut for Ann, it was a ritual of closing a circle. In 1975, she sang these songs like a young lioness. Now she performed them as a woman who understood every line through lived experience. Critics said her voice had only grown stronger. And they were right. It wasn't just powerful, it was wise. What's remarkable is that while other bands of their era were fading, Hart managed to be reborn yet again. By the 2000s, Hart entered a late-period renaissance. Red Velvet Car, 2010, became an unexpected success and their first top 10 album on Billboard in 20 years. Songs like There You Go and Queen City showcased Ann's mature vocal style. Less scream, more soul. Then came Fanatic in 2012. Heavier, louder, more intense. Tracks like Fanatic and Mashallah sounded like an anthem for her newly fierce, liberated era. She was telling the world, I'm still here, and I'm loud not because I have to be, but because I want to be. The rise might have gone even higher, but in 2016, a painful conflict erupted between Ann and Nancy involving Nancy's children and Ann's husband. The band broke apart, temporarily but painfully. Ann went solo and released Immortal, 2018, an album of grief and tribute. She sang the songs of lost artists, Bowie, Chris Cornell, Lennon, and every line sounded like she was speaking to their ghosts. Her voice was dark, heavy, breathtaking in its depth. In 2019, the sisters reconciled and Hart returned to the stage with new material. Ann even released a new solo album, Fierce Bliss, a real gift for anyone who loves her fiery rock presence. And there's no need to wrap up her story because Ann's journey, and Hart's, is still being written. The one truth that has held steady through the decades is this: Ann Wilson is a living monument to the power of the female rock voice. Not an icon in a museum sense, not a legend frozen in time, but a woman who walked through the fire of the music industry and didn't burn. Her later years aren't a fade out, they're a full bloom, where every wrinkle is a story and every note is a victory.